Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Welcome to this morning's lecture. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Annelies Burgess, whom I'm sure many of you probably know from the television programs that she produced during the time when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was holding its hearings. Annelies, as you probably know, is a former television and radio reporter. She was one of the specialist producers for the SABC's Truth Commission special report, and she's okay. I'm too close to the... Okay, let me leave that there then. Okay, how's that now? Is that better? Okay, I'll start again. Annelies is a former television and radio reporter. She was a specialist producer for the SABC's Truth Commission special report, and she's a founder member of Special Assignment. Heist is her first book and signals her return to investigative journalism after a 10-year break, during which she reinvented herself as one of South Africa's leading communication specialists. So let's give her a welcome.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to see that there's some people here. There was a moment where I thought no one was going to arrive, but I'm very happy to see that some people did come. All right, so I'm going to be essentially speaking about my book and trying to give you a little bit of an insight into the topic through the way I wrote the book, because I took a very specific approach to this topic. And I'm hoping that by the end of this lecture we will have a little bit of a better understanding in terms of cash and transit crime, but within the context of organized crime in South Africa. And I call this Dirty Little Secrets because my book ends with a chapter in which we look at what we can learn from cash and transit crime in terms of the broader crime scenario in South Africa. I think we all now know that South Africa has been and continues to be in the grip of a vicious new incarnation of cash and transit. I call it a plague, I call it a virus, and I think even that is an understatement if one really looks at what cash and transit crime means in terms of our country and our economy. The statistics in my book, obviously there's been almost a year now since my book was published, but in the book I looked at the climb in the rate of cash and transit crime. And we know that in 2014 there were 180 CIT incidents, and in 2017, at the end of 2017, there were 378, which was it's like more than 100% increase in just 3 years. So there was this very radical and very fast mutation of this plague within 3 years. Now, over the past year, there have been, we know, and many of you will remember last year, just after my book was published, there was this very big heist in Boksburg that went viral on social media. And that, for me, signaled the turning point, ironically. Despite the fact that all the statistics were there before, and everybody really in the industry and people in the police knew about this mutating virus, there really wasn't, the police weren't really doing much about it. And ironically, it was, I think that was the turning point, was this video that went viral in May last year, because we've seen a lot of action since then, and I'll talk about that a little later, but what's happened in the past year. So at the beginning of last year, this upward trajectory showed no signs of slowing down. In May, when this Boksburg video became known, there was still about 1 CIT a day taking place. And then what happened was we had a new leadership within the police, and they established a JOC between the police, the CIT companies, and everybody in the industry, where they sat together and where they developed a quick response to incidents of cash in transit, and we started seeing a lot of arrests, a lot of dramatic things were being said by the police, a lot of very shiny press releases were being made. But I spoke to someone this morning. I just wanted to make sure that something dramatic hadn't happened since my last talk, and the person is in the industry, and he says, look, a lot has happened, but we are not seeing convictions. We're seeing a lot of arrests, but people aren't being convicted. And then, since this focus on cash in transit by law enforcement, we've seen the virus mutate again. And one of these mutations is that we're seeing the cash in transit phenomenon is now being displaced to other places where there's less heat. So there's a big focus in Gauteng and in Mpumalanga and the areas around Gauteng, but one of the places where cash in transit crime is being displaced to is right here in the Western Cape, and the other is the Eastern Cape where I live. So we are seeing the mutation and people moving to areas where there's less of a focus on this. So a little bit about my book and just about how I went about doing this investigation. I took 10 heists. Initially, I wanted to speak to people. I wanted to speak to cash in transit criminals, and my grand idea was to go into prisons and to maybe speak to people who had been convicted. And then I realized very quickly that was going to be completely impossible because it takes years to get to go through the motions of getting access to prison. So I had to think of a new way of doing it. And I decided to look at 10 heists, but different ones, because when we talk about cash in transit crime, we're not only talking about vehicle on road attacks, we're talking about a whole range of different cash crimes. So I looked at 5 vehicle on road attacks. I looked at 2 very dramatic cash center robberies. I looked at a robbery from a police vault, and I looked at 2 airport heists. And I am now going to take you through 3 of them just to give you a sense of this phenomenon. So in 1997, there was the Bronkhorstspruit heist. It was the first one that I remember making an impression on me. And I'm sure many of you will remember this one because it was a particularly violent one. And for me, it was the beginning of the phenomenon in terms of how we know it today, these massive attacks on the road and massive amounts of money being stolen. So let us look at the hallmarks of that particular crime. It was a very large group that was involved, and it was also a large group of people that were people from different geographical areas were working together on this particular heist. There was insourced expertise, so the gang, which was made up of people from different areas around Gauteng, insourced their expertise. And part of the reason that they collaborated was that different kind of smaller gangs were able to give expertise. The interesting thing about this particular one for me was the fact that police were so integrally involved in not only the planning of this heist, but also in the execution of it. So we had police members who were transporting the weapons in police vehicles to the safe house on a farm outside Bronkhorstspruit the night before, and were then also involved in getting the gang away from the crime scene with the cash and getting the weapons away and getting them through roadblocks and getting them to safety. So the police were very integrally involved. This wasn't a case where somebody was, an investigating officer was maybe crashing the docket. This was a case where they were actually involved, providing the weapons. And then this was, of course, extreme violence, and I will talk later about the fact that cash and transit crime is known for its violence, although there is a little bit of a twist to that, which I'll speak about later. The people who are involved in cash and transit crime, the fear factor is a very important part of the arsenal and a very important part of getting the job done. The fact that people know when a cash and transit heist goes down, the worst can happen. We see very extreme use of violence. In this particular case, they used a spiked chain across the road. And there were 2 cash and transit vans, and there was a vehicle that was supposed to provide additional security. And the escort vehicle, the two people in the escort vehicle were very heavily wounded when they went over this chain, but were still alive. And according to the investigating officer who later spoke to one of the people, obviously, who was arrested, they were executed because he said to him that they didn't want to leave any evidence, any witnesses. And then there was also, in that particular one, in this incredible shooting that happened, there was a person who was driving along. He was the chief fire officer, the deputy chief fire officer in Pretoria, and he was very, very heavily wounded in this crossfire, but also became a very good witness in the case. And then a very interesting part of this case, and something that we will see in the other cases, are these expensive, very expensive, high-powered defense teams who come in if it goes wrong and people are arrested. In this particular case, a very, very good defense team. I actually interviewed one of the defense lawyers in my book, and there's a whole chapter on him. But what was interesting about this case was that they tried to buy off the investigating officer twice. Initially, they offered him 400,000 rand, and he, of course, said no. In my book, I love this particular police officer. Is one of my favorite characters, incredibly upstanding and committed cop. And he obviously said no. And then towards the end, when it was clear that this was not really going to go their way, they offered him another 1 million rand. And he didn't take the bribes, and they were sent to prison. But it's a very important one, this case is a very important one to understand the modus operandi, because it's very similar, as I will show you, in the 20 years since then. And then there's a little quote there from my book. The robbers descended on the abandoned cash van, broke open the back, and loaded the money bags before making their getaway. All along the way, the police accomplices met them. All along the way, the money, men, and firearms were transferred into the police vehicle, which then made their way back to the farm base where they had spent the previous 2 days. Okay, so that's where we start with the story. Now let's fast forward about 10 years, Johannesburg International Airport. Once again, a very large, diverse group that was involved. Once again, people from different geographical areas that were pulled in. There was a group called the so-called Spruit View group, who were very, very good at the operations, the on-the-ground operations, and they were brought in the first attempt. They later then left. And other people were brought in. But once again, we see people collaborating, insourcing of expertise, and different people from different areas working together. And this is an important thing to understand, because we see that now. We see with the displacement to different provinces, it's very clear that people are working together with criminal networks across the country. Excellent planning, took a very long time, and then very significant insider participation. The airport security and the CIT security companies who were responsible for securing the money at the airport were all very, very involved in this. And once again, we see police involvement. At approximately 9:30, a gang of 10 men wearing balaclavas, blue overalls, gloves, and reflector jackets had driven onto the apron in maintenance vehicles. They were armed with automatic and semi-automatic rifles. They struck just after a container with 11.37 million US dollars, 1.5 million rand, and 20,000 euros had been offloaded from the aircraft by the driver of a Cargomatic, who was in the process of transferring it to a security truck for transport to the offices of a security company. So once again, they knew exactly what they were doing. They went into this incredibly secure. I mean, I went there. You can't believe that people can just drive in and do this. And we saw the same modus operandi happening very recently. A couple of years ago, there was again this very dramatic heist at Johannesburg International Airport. Okay, and then the last one, the most recent one, and the one that I find incredibly fascinating, was a cash center heist in Witbank, or Emalahleni. And Emalahleni is seen as the cash in transit hotspot in South Africa, because it's at the center of a number of roads that go to the north of South Africa. And there's a very, very big cash center that SBV has in Witbank, and there was this unbelievably sophisticated and unbelievably lucrative event that took place in 2014. They stole 107 million rand in one night from this cash center. So the modus operandi in this case was there were people who had to impersonate police officers. They went to the cash center at night. They presented themselves. They told the guards on duty that they were there to arrest them, and spun a story. The guards kind of realized something was wrong and didn't want to let them in, and then they acted very quickly. They abducted the guards, took them to a very strange kind of dumping site where they tortured them for hours on end. And then the gang moved in, and they cut through into this cash center and worked through the night to do this. And in the early hours of the morning, they realized they were running out of time, so they sent a team to go and abduct the second set of security officers who were to come on duty. And they were also taken to this dump site where they were also brutalized and very strange. One doesn't understand why that was necessary, but I think it's part of this kind of the violence of this particular crime. And they were then ultimately given some narcotic, nobody knows what it was, which sent them into a coma. And all four of the guards were taken to a mine outside Witbank. It was a public holiday the next day, and they were dumped at the entrance to this mine. And it was only by absolute chance that people at this mine came in that day. There was a very urgent coal issue they had to deal with, and it was completely by chance that two people came to that mine and found these four men lying there. And they survived, but it was the state's position that it was an attempted murder. They would not have survived if people hadn't found them. The interesting thing in this Witbank case is we always speak about the men who are involved in cash and transit robberies, but in this particular case, there were two women who were very integral to the whole thing. There was a woman called Gift, who was the so-called finger man or finger woman, the person on the inside who gave all the information. She gave information on the layout, on the security, on the vaults and all of that. And then there was another woman who was recruited to impersonate a police officer. And both these women became state witness and were absolutely integral in actually sending this gang to prison. Now, the interesting thing about this case, and it speaks to one of my key findings, is once again we saw the absolute intimate involvement of police officers. In fact, the brain behind this entire heist was an acting police detective in Witbank at the time. And he was, in fact, the first responder on the scene on the morning when they realized the cash center had been breached. The person who arrived was the master brain of the heist, acting as a police officer, being there, taking statements. And he realized that something had gone wrong. They had deactivated all the security cameras, but there was one old DVR that no one had known about, that Gift, the finger woman, hadn't known about. And this DVR had been secretly recording some of the stuff that had been happening there. And he realized that this was a problem. And he went from the scene of the crime, he went to the safe house nearby where they were counting money. The evidence led in court was there was so much money, you can imagine 107 million rand, that was stacked so high that they couldn't see each other over the stacks. And it took 2 days to count the money. So this guy, the brain, but also lucky, also the police officer arrived at the safe house and said, we've got a big problem. This didn't go as smoothly as we expected. And he said 40 million rand needs to be taken away and set aside for someone who will come and fetch this 40 million rand. And some very smartly dressed chaps arrived. We know now that one of them was an ex-Hawk police ex-captain in the Hawks, and he was given 40 million rand to bribe people in law enforcement to try and make this case go away. Fortunately, it didn't. And the ex-Hawks captain was one of the people who was then sent to prison very recently. So it was a very sophisticated and well-planned heist. And once again, we see this involvement of police officers. There were, of the gang, and they don't think they got the whole gang, but of the people that were successfully prosecuted in the end, there was this chap, Lucky, that acting police detective, and there were at least 2 other police officers and some reservists who were all involved. Okay, so that's kind of just giving you a sense of the story. I don't know, did you want to ask something? These are all different groups. They are all different groupings, and yeah. In none of the cases that I looked at in my book was there any overlap. There was one overlap, but I'll explain that later. Yeah, but they do collaborate, but there are lots of different groupings doing this. It's not as if there's some mastermind sitting, coordinating all these different things. They're all different, sophisticated, and very experienced people, which is what brings me to this point, is it's a crime of prestige. It's 100% a crime of prestige. There was some incredible research done by Dr. Henny Lochner. He used to be a high-ranking police officer, and he interviewed 20 incarcerated CIT robbers in prison, and he said the one thing that came out from his interviews was the key thing was this fact that it's seen as a crime of prestige. He said to me that there were 4 defining elements that came out of his interviews that the robbers said were the reason that they committed CIT crime. Financial greed was the one, the availability of large amounts of cash, and then the respect that comes with being a cash and transit robber, the prestige. It was explained, the people that he interviewed, I might just go to the next slide because I might actually be talking about stuff that I have on this slide. So he found that criminals who are involved in CIT crime graduate to CIT crime. They start at the bottom of the food chain and they work themselves up. And when you are a CIT robber, you are the cream. You are the best of the best. The people that he interviewed all had jobs before they went into cash and transit crime. They were amongst the jobs that they had were handymen, taxi drivers, policemen. One was a professional boxer, and one identified himself as a disco dancer. And 2 were university students. So it's interesting to see. So there's always this argument that cash and transit crime is it about greed or is it about need? And the evidence from research that we've seen by Dr. Henny Lochner and another academic's work that I will come to now, it's very clear that one of the big driving forces here behind this crime is in fact greed. Then just talking about the graduation from crime, the criminals that he interviewed said that in general, the age at which they got involved was around 22, but some of them were as young as 16 when they got involved in crime, not in CIT, in crime. And the graduation happens from jobs like housebreaking, bank robbery, then you graduate to car and truck hijackings. There were even people who've been involved in kidnappings. But they start at the bottom. And one of the people that he interviewed, I found it so fascinating. He said he had started right at the bottom with the kind of bottom-level crime, and he'd said he'd done about 50 house break-ins, home invasions, and he said he thinks about 1,000 hijackings of vehicles and theft, but he wasn't sure. It could have been more. So it shows how when you get to the top, when you are a CIT robber, you know what you're doing. You're very good at what you do. And people say it's a vocation. People are proud of their skill in this crime. Then what Dr. Henny Lochner said, he said the thing that distinguishes cash and transit crime from any other crime is the level of planning that goes in. he says he was completely astonished by the detailed planning that goes into cash and transit crime. He says that on average it took between 15 and 18 months to plan a robbery or CIT robbery, and one took up to 2 years to plan properly. And then he also makes this finding that the CIT gangs or groupings are generally around 15 strong, but they can be up to 30 or 40. As we know in the Witbank case, there were at least 40, and in the Bronkhorstspruit one too. And he is the person who talks about the fact that this is the most violent crime of all. I said there was a bit of a twist to that because I had spoken to some people, some cash and transit robbers. It was very interesting. After my book was published, I got a number of calls from people, from cash and transit operatives who wanted to chat to me, and I went to see them. And it was very fascinating. They all said to me, I said, so what makes you do this? And they said, it's lucrative, it's easy, and there's absolutely no chance that I will get arrested. Not absolutely no chance, but a very low chance. It's a very low risk crime. All right, let me just look here if I've spoken about all of this. Okay, so I've spoken about the fact that it's so well planned and organized, and the money that gets invested in sourcing skills and crew. You source people who are good drivers, you source people who can hijack the necessary vehicles or steal the necessary vehicle, you source in people who will be good on the scene, you source in getaway drivers, and Harry Lochner makes the point. He says he was completely astonished at the ease with which they were able to buy off law enforcement officers, from people in, traffic cops, right up to the top. So one of the reasons that people believe, for instance, there was this huge spike in Mpumalanga in the last 2 years was that the cash and transit gangs had a very good network in Mpumalanga where they were able to, where they'd paid off enough high-ranking people in law enforcement that investigations never went anywhere. All right, and then we talk about the grooming and the recruiting of people from inside companies, and then I've spoken about how they groom and recruit police officers to assist. Now, there's another fascinating piece of academic research that I relied on very heavily and was given permission by Dr. Tobani to use. And the key, she interviewed 40 cash in transit robbers in prisons across Gauteng. And they weren't all cash in transit, but they were all involved in cash crimes. Most of them were cash in transit. And her key finding is that there's no turning back. Once people have graduated to this sophisticated and very lucrative crime like CIT, there is no turning back. They will go back once they are released from prison. And in fact, it's such a big factor that cash and transit companies are now tracking the release dates of incarcerated criminals, because they can then start modeling where they think there will be spikes, because they will know to what geographical areas the people will go to once they are released, and they are then able to monitor. So she found also this long criminal career before you graduate to cash crimes. She says almost every single one she spoke to, she says they said they will return to crime after they are released. They talk about the fact that the rehabilitation doesn't work. There was this quite humorous interview where one of the criminals says to her, I'm in prison and they want to give me anger management courses. It's like, I don't have a problem with anger. I just want money. And it was quite a humorous thing, but underneath that we kind of see how there's this pull factor in terms of you go out and you can go back into this crime, but there's also a push factor in the sense that the rehabilitation in prisons doesn't really work for people. It might work for other kinds of crime, but it certainly doesn't work for cash and transit criminals. And then it comes out very strongly in her research how they see themselves as professionals. They don't see themselves as run-of-the-mill criminals. They see themselves as this is a vocation. One of the interviewers say, this is my job, and I'm really good at it. and very proud of their skills. And one must understand the level of skill that must go into pulling off a successful cash and transit robbery. Then what she also found, which I found very interesting, was the importance of mysticism in the process of preparing for a heist. And it's something I saw in almost all 10 heists that I looked at. There were a number of them where this wasn't spoken about or didn't come up in court. But there is often this very important process before a heist where people or these criminals have to go as a group together to see a sangoma or some kind of mystic to cleanse themselves. And also the role of a sangoma, for instance, is to, as one says, kyk die pad, to be able to see if this will be a successful robbery, to see if there are going to be roadblocks. And it's interesting, for instance, in the airport robbery in 2006, it was a very diverse group of people. There were working class people, there were professional people who worked for AXA, who were earning big salaries, who were involved. There were people from Cape Town, there were Afrikaans-speaking people, there were English-speaking people, there were people from a range of religious backgrounds. And yet, twice before this happened, the entire crew had to go to Soweto, where they had to go through a ritual. And two of the people involved in this particular robbery were Muslims, but they went along because it was important for the group to go along. And while the others bathed themselves at the Sangoma's place, they didn't want to, but they dipped their hands into this bath that the others were bathing themselves in. And so it's a very important element, very important part of cash and transit crime is the belief, the absolute belief in the power of mysticism. All the people that Dr. Tobani interviewed, for instance, she said, but all of them were adamant about the importance of involving the Sangoma, for instance, in the rituals beforehand. And she says, but that clearly didn't work because you're in prison. And they would insist that it was their fault, that they had not followed the instructions properly, or they had done something that they had done something wrong, that it wasn't actually a failure of the Sangoma. And this was the next point. The democratic structure of groupings is very interesting. Cash and transit groupings are democratic. There might be a person who's in charge of organizing it, but there's no boss, as you would see in a mafia group or other organized crime groupings. There's a very democratic structure. Everybody takes part, and everybody is part of making decisions. And the people Dr. Tobani spoke to said the reason for that is you need everybody to be equally invested, because if there's a boss, it becomes a security risk. People get pissed off with each other. And we see that time after time, that in the cases, the very rare cases where cash and transit crime is successfully prosecuted, almost always the only reason they are successfully prosecuted is because somebody turned state witness. And often that state witness is someone who has an axe to grind. For instance, in the Bronkhorstspruit case, that case would not have been successfully prosecuted if it hadn't been for one of the original members who turned state witness. And the only reason that he decided to turn state witness was that after the first attempt, which is a failed attempt, he had been bumped by a car that had passed and had been slightly hurt, but he wanted to be part of the second attempt. And the team, the grouping, decided that he could not be part of that second attempt because there was some bad luck associated with him. And in the end, he felt hard done by and flipped. And it's the same thing that we see in a number of these cases. There's another case I write about in my book where the person who was absolutely integral, all the planning meetings, everything took place at his house. He knew everything. But he felt hard done by in the end because he hadn't been given the same cut as the other people. So there's a democratic structure of the groupings, which is an interesting thing. And this is the twist I spoke about. Despite the fact that we know they are very violent and they use guns, and they will not hesitate to use the guns. A number of the people I spoke to said, we prefer not to shoot someone, because if we hurt someone or if we kill someone, it creates a whole nother level of drama we have to deal with. So they will go in all guns blazing, but I think, well, at least some of the people said to me that we are professionals, we don't go in to kill. We go in to get the money, and it's a last resort. But we like to do clean jobs. So I thought that was interesting. And then, this is interesting, being on bail is no deterrent for these criminals. I read this morning, as I was trying to just refresh my memory before I came here, I saw an interview with the police minister, Becky Cele, who spoke about a man who was arrested last year who had been out on bail 41 times. I don't know how that even happens, but it's from the mouth of our police minister. And then the final point, which is probably the most important point, is that, and it was the most depressing thing that came out of this book for me, was the fact that there was absolutely no fear of the criminal justice system. We look at the research done by Dr. Tobani, we look at the research done by Dr. Lochner. I look at the interviews that I had. Just after my book was published, I met a very experienced CIT operative at the Wimpy in the east of Johannesburg, and I had a very fascinating conversation with him, and I said to him, why don't you fear the justice system? Because he said it's so low risk. And he says, well, the chances of me being arrested are incredibly low. If I do get arrested, the chances that the investigating officer will mess up the case is pretty good. If not, I can probably buy him off. If that doesn't work, it'll go to court, and then probably the prosecutor will mess up the case. If he doesn't mess it up, I will probably be able to buy him off. And then he spoke about the fact that one goes right up to magistrates, and there's a suggestion. Judges, I don't particularly believe that, but I also spoke to some defense attorneys who had done extensive work on cash and transit cases, and they just laugh. They say, we're not called in anymore to do the work that we used to do for the cash and transit groupings, because they found a different way. And I said, what is the different way? He says, it's much cheaper and much easier just to buy off people in the system. So he said, it's very sad for me. The one I spoke to says, it's very sad for me. I get much less work. But all right, so I've said this. It's easy, it's lucrative, it's low risk. That's what drives cash and transit crime. Okay, I just have to keep an eye on the time. I feel as if I'm talking incredibly long. Oh gosh, I must move. So I spoke to prosecutors, police officers, academics, robbers, court records, thousands of pages of court records, crime scene pictures I looked at, witness testimony, media reports, video footage, and then spoke to many intelligence operators within crime intelligence and within cash and transit companies. And let me just quickly wrap up what we know. We know, and this is where I come to my dirty little secrets. Right. We know that most of the money that is stolen is never recovered. I looked at 10 heists. That is a microscopic sample of the thousands and thousands of cases we've had over the last 20 years. And in just this tiny little microscopic case, 425 million rand was stolen, of which 30 million rand, around 30 million rand, was recovered, of which 14 million rand was subsequently restolen from a police vault, which brings it down to around 15 million rand. No. So we understand what that means. When we talk about lucrative, we're talking about massively lucrative. Then the case that I've spoken about, the dirty little secret number 2, is that cops are involved, and obviously also people from inside the companies. In the 10 heists that I look at in my book, only 3 were done without the help of police officers in different guises, either helping on the scene, being involved in the planning, helping with the transporting of weapons. There was one case in Pinetown where a high-ranking crime intelligence officer was in charge of producing the armor-piercing bullets. So it's something that since my book was published, I get into trouble a lot with cops, but they are starting to actually now agree with me because they're starting to realize how problematic this is. In the beginning, they said to me, you're trying to create this impression that this is a crime that is driven by police officers. And I said, it's not driven by police officers, but they are most certainly involved. I mean, we just have to look at how many police officers are now being arrested in more recent cases. Right, so that's the other thing. Now, the other dirty little secret is that people think it's okay to steal from CIT companies. This is not a South African phenomenon. In 2014, there was research done by the British Security Industry Association where the respondents, the majority of the respondents said, this is a business crime with no impact on people. And they kind of see it as a victimless crime. There was some very, in 2001, there was a case in Cape Town that presided over by Justice Paul Hoffman, and he in his judgment talks about the anarchistic notion of entitlement that cash in transit robbers have. They are entitled to steal. And then I found a very interesting piece of research by a crime expert, Jenny Irish Koboshane, who does interviews with criminals, and they speak about just and unjust crime. And cash in transit is seen as a just crime because you are stealing from companies, from people with money, and you are essentially taking what is yours. It's a simplistic kind of interpretation of what she's saying, but we do see in the interviews that these academics have done, also we see a complete lack of or any sense that this is wrong. And then the fourth point is that there's another. Hang on. I want to. Okay. So the fourth point is that organized crime is attacking our economy. I don't think we realize the cost to our economy. In 2017, 119 billion rand was pumped through the arteries of the South African economy in cash. And that increases every year by about 10%, I'm told, by SASABRIC. We know in South Africa that about 60% of adult people, I found this very surprising, but 60% of South African adults are not banked. And that 84% of all transactions in South Africa are still in cash. So we can see the cash and transit companies are responsible for putting the cash into the arteries of the economy. And if they are under siege, our economy is under siege. It's as simple as that. Then my other dirty secret is the fact that we are completely in denial about the other costs of crime. And apart from the cost in terms of just the like straight up and down cost in terms of the economy, there is this cost to us, to the social fabric of our country. I mean, we've become so inured to crime. One just has to go and look at the videos of cash in transit crime. There are lots of them on YouTube. And you go and look at the soundtrack of the people videoing those cash in transit incidents. People are completely inured. It's like, oh my gosh, they just blew up that van. Oh, look, they're shooting on the highway. There's this thing that frightens me about the way we've become inured to crime. I can't see how this doesn't have an incredible effect on our kind of the fabric, social fabric of our country. And then I'm not even speaking about the other costs, the costs of law enforcement, the costs of these long trials, the costs of the witness protection, the costs of ensuring the increasing insurance on cash, the cost of all these ATMs that are blown up and the vehicles that are blown up. One cash and transit company tells me that just the vehicles they lost last year cost them 67 million rand. So then dirty little secret number 6, and I'm going to go really fast now, is that CIT companies are not doing enough. That certainly they are starting to agree. After 2006, there was a dramatic drop in cash and transit crime, and everybody became completely complacent. And cash and transit companies started cutting back on a lot of, on training, on armor, on a lot of stuff that would ultimately down the line make it easier again for this virus to mutate. But the point that nobody is speaking about is that the cash and transit companies are under enormous financial pressure. In 1999, a cash and transit company would have been paid about 3,000 rand to pick up cash from a business 6 times a week. 3,000 rand. In 2016, that was down to 1,500 rand for the same service. So there's an incredible pressure on profitability, and that's having and had an impact on professionalism. So that certainly we know, and they're starting to admit that too. And then, of course, we know the cops are not doing enough. I mean, the South African Police Service has been turning a blind eye to cash and transit crime. They have been completely incompetent over the past 10 years. They have been ignoring this. I mean, I know the South African Police Service has a lot of other stuff to deal with. This is not a country without other crime problems. But I certainly am absolutely convinced when I look at the research that the fact that the police were so quiet about cash and transit crime, that we saw no arrests, we saw no significant prosecutions, that was a very key element in the mutation of this virus. Dirty little secret number 8, and we know that. Many of you will be very aware of the fact of how crime intelligence became complicit in the past, in the Zuma era especially, became involved in politics rather than in business intelligence and crime intelligence, which we need to do proactive policing. So the spike in cash and transit crime is very, very large part of that, is about the fact that crime intelligence failed. Then, dirty secret number 9, South Africa is completely drowning in illegal guns, illegally obtained guns. The police stats, 2016, the police stats tell us that about 20 guns a day are stolen from civilians and about 2 from cops. I have no idea I have no doubt that is ridiculously low. But even if we go on that, we know that there are pipelines of guns coming in from Mozambique, even from Angola and Zimbabwe. I mean, that's an issue. And then the biggest problem, I think, is the fact that so many guns are stolen from police armories and from the army. And also in cash in transit crime, every cash in transit incident also pushes more of the guns that take off the scene into this under what I call this river of illegal guns. Just to give you an idea, in 2016, a senior police officer who was in charge of the Germiston Armory was arrested. Many of you will be aware of this case. He was arrested and he's been sent to prison for a very long time. He was arrested for taking 2,400 weapons that were earmarked to be destroyed and for selling these to gangs in the Western Cape. 2,400 weapons that were just taken straight into the river. And then the last dirty little secret is the fact that the problem with CIT is that we focus on CIT, but the problem is actually much, much bigger than CIT. I spoke at a conference recently which was attended by people in the high-value cargo industry. People, the trucks and the logistics companies that transport electronics, alcohol, and high-value cargo. That industry is having up to 5 heists a day. So CIT, I think, is the tip of the iceberg, and it's a much, much bigger problem, perpetrated by the same people who do CIT. So that's the end of my talk. I don't know if people have questions. There seem to be questions. Yes?
Somebody is losing a lot of money.
Yes.
Whether it's banks or insurance companies or whoever, they're losing obviously billions.
Yes.
Surely they must be very concerned. Surely they must be working on some system, some solutions to this problem.
They are very concerned. they are obviously incredibly worried because, I mean, these are private companies that have to look at their bottom line too in the end. And this obviously has an enormous impact on them being profitable, as I explained. There's a lot happening. Many of the companies are now, I mean, there's a lot of new energy over the past, I would say, since May last year when this whole became such a big issue. There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of cooperation between the police and between cash and transit companies, which was not happening before. I think the fact that we also have new leadership at crime intelligence, new leadership in the police, has a big impact on the fact that cash and transit companies are starting to feel that they actually can talk to crime intelligence and not be compromised, that they can work with the cops. So they're doing a lot, and then there is a lot of stuff that is happening in terms of improved technology, improving technology, improving a lot of the kind of security measures they take. And I think a lot of why this is happening is there's a very big push now that there must be legislation which actually makes it. At the moment, there's no legislation for the CIT company. There are no basic rules of engagement. There's no legislation that says you have to have this level of technology or this kind of armor. So there is a lot happening. But I mean, they know they've admitted that they have been outwitted. I mean, some of the companies are getting hit less, but a company like G4S is just being hit. They had 5 cash and transit heists again since the beginning of the year. So I'm not aware of everything that's happening, but I certainly, from what I hear, they are trying to. Yes.
One of the biggest problems is the volume of cash
Yes.
being